The history of 20th century wars is full of paradoxes. One of the most astonishing is Colonel General Pavel Alexeyevich Belov, a commander whose path began in the saddle and ended at the helm of a new-age war machine. In an era when tanks and airplanes turned the battlefield into a mechanized hell, this cavalry general not only survived, he thrived, proving that true military art can adapt to any technological revolution. 1941, the snow-covered fields of the Moscow region. Here, when the country's fate hung by a thread, Belov's cavalrymen accomplished the impossible: a deep raid into the rear of German troops, combining the traditional mobility of cavalry with the firepower of motorized units. This raid became a symbol of the astonishing symbiosis of old and new, mounted and mechanized. How did a commander, raised in the traditions of the Cossack lava, manage to find a place for a saber in a world of tank wedges? How did cavalry, this seemingly anachronism, manage to become an effective instrument of modern warfare? Belov's story is not just the biography of a military leader. It is a tale of the transformation of military art, of seeking a balance between tradition and innovation, of the human genius's ability to adapt to changing conditions. Pavel Alexeyevich Belov was born in 1897 in the village of Shuiskoye, Vologda Governorate, into a simple peasant family. Nothing in his early years portended the brilliant military career that awaited him. However, fate decreed otherwise. The First World War overturned the life of young Pavel, when, in 1916, he was conscripted into the army and sent to ensign school in Peterhof. This was a time when cavalry was still considered the elite of the armed forces, and cavalry charges remained an important element of military tactics. However, even then, the war began to change. Machine guns, artillery, and the first tanks gradually turned traditional cavalry charges into suicidal undertakings. Belov, having received an officer's rank, witnessed this transformation. The Civil War became for him a true school of combat experience. In 1918, he joined the Red Army, where his experience and talent were quickly noticed. Commanding cavalry units, Belov fought on the Southern Front against Denikin's troops, then on the Western Front, against the Poles, and on the Caucasian Front, against the remnants of the White Armies. It was in these battles that his unique understanding of the role of cavalry in modern warfare was formed. Unlike many old-school commanders, Belov did not cling to the romantic image of a cavalry charge with sabers drawn. He saw how the nature of combat operations was changing and understood. To survive, cavalry must evolve. In the 20s, when the country was healing the wounds of the Civil War, Belov continued his military education. He graduated from the higher academic courses and then from the prestigious Frunze Military Academy. His analytical mind absorbed new military theories, concepts of deep operations, and ideas of interaction between different branches of service. In the 30s, when fierce discussions about the future of cavalry were taking place in the army, Belov took a pragmatic stance. He did not advocate for the preservation of cavalry for nostalgic reasons, but saw its practical value: the ability to operate in off-road conditions, in wooded areas, in mud, when mechanized units lost their mobility. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, Belov was already commanding the 5th Cavalry Corps. Under his leadership, this formation was not an anachronism, but a flexible combat unit that combined traditional cavalry qualities with elements of modern warfare. The Corps included not only cavalry regiments, but also artillery divisions, tank units, and motorcycle companies. The 1920s were a time of profound military theoretical discussions about the future of the army. The First World War showed that the era of classical cavalry was fading into the past, but it was too early to completely write off this branch of service. Military theorists were divided into two camps. Some considered cavalry a relic of the past, while others saw its potential for new forms of combat application. In the Soviet Union, this discussion became particularly acute. Prominent military leaders such as Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Vladimir Triandafilov advocated for the priority development of mechanized and tank forces. They believed that the future lay in deep operations using motorized units. Their opponents, among whom Semyon Budyonny stood out, championed the preservation of large cavalry formations. Pavel Belov held a special position in these debates. Being a cavalryman by education and experience, he nevertheless clearly understood the inevitability of technical modernization. In his articles and speeches of those years, he wrote, "Cavalry should not resist motorization, but lead it. Our task is to preserve the mobility and maneuverability of cavalry, strengthening its firepower with modern means." Belov proposed the concept of mounted mechanized formations, where traditional cavalry units were reinforced with armored cars, tankettes, motorcyclists, and light artillery on mechanical traction. Such formations, in his opinion, retained the advantages of cavalry: the ability to operate on rough terrain, in conditions of impassable roads and off-road, but at the same time possessed significantly greater striking power. Belov paid special attention to tactical issues. He understood that in the era of machine guns and rapid-fire artillery, a classical cavalry charge in mounted formation became suicide. Instead, he developed concepts for raiding operations in the enemy's rear, where cavalry could use its mobility to disrupt communications, destroy rear facilities, and create panic. In the 1930s, Belov's ideas began to be put into practice. Cavalry divisions were armed with light tanks, armored cars, and artillery on mechanical traction. The organizational structure also changed. Tank regiments of cavalry divisions appeared. Belov himself actively participated in the development of new regulations and manuals that governed the actions of modernized cavalry. The experience of local conflicts in the 1930s proved particularly valuable. Events on the Chinese Eastern Railway, battles at Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol, as well as the experience of the Spanish Civil War, provided rich material for analysis. Belov carefully studied these conflicts, drawing lessons for his concept of mounted mechanized forces. By the late 1930s, it became clear that the future lay with large mechanized formations. However, Belov and his like-minded colleagues managed to prove that there was also a place for modernized cavalry in modern warfare. Cavalry corps remained in the structure of the Red Army, but now they represented complex mounted mechanized formations capable of solving a wide range of tasks. By the mid-1930s, it became evident that cavalry was in dire need of modernization. The era of purely mounted formations was fading into the past, yet completely abandoning this branch of service was premature. Thus began the evolution of cavalry units, which were tasked with finding their place in the changing world of military art. In 1935, tank squadrons, equipped with light T-26 tanks, appeared within the structure of cavalry divisions. Subsequently, these squadrons grew into regiments. Cavalry units were armed with BA-10 and BA-20 armored vehicles, mechanized artillery, and motorcycle units. This is how cavalry mechanized groups were born. Hybrid formations that combined the traditional maneuverability of cavalry with the firepower of motorized units. Pavel Belov actively participated in this transformation. Commanding the 5th Cavalry Corps, he turned it into a veritable laboratory of military thought. New tactical approaches were practiced during exercises. Mounted units blazed trails through forests and swamps where equipment would bog down, and then tanks and armored vehicles would break into operational space to deliver a decisive blow. In his diary, Belov wrote, "Horse and engine are not enemies but allies. Each is strong in its own element. The commander's task is to skillfully utilize the advantages of both." Particular attention was paid to personnel training. Cavalrymen mastered skills of interaction with tanks, learning to operate as dismounted groups supported by armored vehicles. Tank crews, in turn, assimilated the specifics of joint operations with cavalry. Belov demanded that corps officers be knowledgeable not only in cavalry tactics, but also in the fundamentals of tank warfare. By the early 1940s, the Cavalry Corps of the Red Army represented complex combat organisms. They comprised mounted divisions, tank regiments, and motorized units. Such formations could operate under a wide variety of conditions, overcoming water obstacles, traversing forests, and conducting deep raids into enemy rear areas. Pavel Belov understood that the future lay with fully mechanized formations, but he also saw potential for modernized cavalry. He told his officers, "As long as Russia has impassable roads, forests, and swamps, cavalry will not become a thing of the past. Our task is to combine centuries of cavalry art with the might of modern technology." In the pre-war years, Cavalry Corps regularly participated in large-scale exercises where various combat scenarios were practiced. Special emphasis was placed on raiding operations in the rear of a hypothetical enemy. It was here that cavalry mechanized formations could best demonstrate their qualities. On June 22, 1941, the Great Patriotic War began. For Pavel Belov's Cavalry Corps, as for the entire Red Army, it was a test of strength. The 5th Cavalry Corps met the war as part of the 16th Army on the western border in the Bialystok area. The first days of the war became a real test for the concept of cavalry mechanized formations, which Belov had been developing for so long. The Wehrmacht advanced with powerful tank wedges, supported by aviation. German motorized units demonstrated superiority in maneuverability and firepower. However, Belov's cavalrymen did not flinch. Utilizing their knowledge of the terrain, they carried out audacious counterattacks on the flanks of German columns, disrupted communications, and set up ambushes. In the first weeks of the war, Belov demonstrated his tactical mastery. Understanding that a direct clash with enemy tank units would be suicidal, he used the cavalry's maneuverability for actions on the flanks and in the rear of enemy wedges. Cavalry squadrons penetrated through forested areas where enemy equipment could not pass, delivering unexpected blows. Particularly effective was the interaction of cavalry with the Corps' tank units. The cavalrymen identified weak points in the enemy's defenses, and then the tanks delivered a concentrated strike. This tactic allowed for the conservation of forces and inflicted maximum damage on the enemy. Despite tactical successes, the strategic situation was not in favor of Soviet troops. Under pressure from superior enemy forces, Belov's corps was forced to retreat. However, even the retreat turned into a series of counterattacks. Belov wrote in his memoirs, "We retreated, but we forced the enemy to pay with blood for every kilometer of our land." In July 1941, Belov's corps participated in the Battle of Smolensk. Here, the advantages of cavalry mechanized formations fully manifested themselves. When German tank wedges broke through, Belov's cavalrymen attacked their stretched communications, disrupting fuel and ammunition supplies. The cavalry's ability to operate in off-road and wooded terrain proved especially valuable. Where German equipment got stuck in swamps or could not pass through dense forests, horse squadrons passed freely. This allowed for unexpected strikes and disappearance before the enemy could organize a pursuit. By the autumn of 1941, Belov's corps, despite losses, maintained its combat effectiveness. Moreover, the combat experience gained allowed for the improvement of the tactics of cavalry mechanized formations. Belov constantly analyzed the results of battles, made adjustments to personnel training, and sought new forms of interaction between cavalry, tanks, and artillery. In November 1941, when German troops were rushing towards Moscow, the 5th Cavalry Corps was transformed into the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps. This was a recognition of the merits of Belov and his subordinates. Ahead of them lay the main test, the legendary raid behind enemy lines during the Battle of Moscow. By November 1941, the situation near Moscow had reached a critical point. German troops were within a few dozen kilometers of the capital, encircling the city in a semicircle. However, the exhaustion of German forces, stretched communications, and the onset of cold weather created conditions for a counteroffensive. Soviet command was preparing a decisive strike that was intended to push the enemy back from Moscow. Under these circumstances, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command decided to create a special formation capable of operating deep behind enemy lines. The 5th Cavalry Corps, commanded by Pavel Belov, was transformed into the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps. This was not merely a renaming. The Corps received better weaponry, personnel reinforcements, and a special status. The Corps included 2 cavalry divisions, the 2nd Guards and the 9th, a tank brigade, artillery and mortar units, as well as special forces units. This was a classic example of a cavalry mechanized group, which Belov had spoken about in the pre-war years. The task set for the Corps was exceptionally difficult: to break through the front line, reach the rear of the German Army Group Center, and disrupt its communications. In fact, Belov's cavalrymen were to operate in complete encirclement, without reliable communication with the main forces, relying only on their own resources and partisan support. General Zhukov, summoning Belov to a meeting, explained the strategic concept of the operation. Your corps is a knife that we are plunging into the enemy's back. While the main forces deliver frontal blows, you must cut German communications, sow panic in the rear, and tie down enemy reserves. Belov understood that such an operation required meticulous preparation. Under his leadership, the Corps headquarters developed a detailed action plan. Special attention was paid to supply issues. The Corps had to operate autonomously for a long time. Stocks of ammunition, food, fodder for horses, and fuel for tanks and vehicles were created. Reconnaissance became the most important element of preparation. Belov personally instructed the scouts, who were to penetrate the front line and gather information about the disposition of German units, road conditions, and possible routes of movement. Especially valuable was information about German rear facilities, warehouses, headquarters, airfields. The Corps commander paid special attention to personnel training. Cavalrymen and tank crews practiced coordination, learned to operate in small groups, and mastered the tactics of sudden raids. Behind enemy lines, we will not be able to count on air support and heavy artillery, Belov told the officers. Our main weapons are surprise, maneuver, and decisiveness. To maintain communication with the command, the Corps received several radio stations and a group of experienced radio operators. Contacts were established with partisan detachments operating in the German rear. The partisans were to provide guides, information about the enemy, and, if possible, food. On November 15, 1941, Pavel Belov received the final order for the operation. The Corps was to break through the enemy's defenses southwest of Moscow and reach the Vyazma area, a vital transport hub in the rear of the German Army Group Center. The start date of the operation was set for the first days of December, when the general counteroffensive of Soviet troops near Moscow was to begin. On the eve of the operation, Belov gathered the commanders of units and subunits. "We face a difficult task," he said, "but it is precisely for such actions that our cavalry mechanized formations were created. We will prove that cavalry in modern warfare is not a relic of the past, but an effective strike force." The operation assigned to Belov's Corps was an integral part of the overall strategic design of the counteroffensive near Moscow. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command viewed the actions of the Cavalry Corps not as an isolated raid, but as an important element of a complex, multi-layered operation to defeat the German Army Group Center. While the main forces of the Western, Kalinin, and Southwestern fronts delivered frontal blows, Belov's Corps was to operate deep behind enemy lines, disrupting communications, diverting reserves, and creating the effect of a Soviet presence over a vast territory. The strategic concept involved creating chaos in the German rear, precisely at the moment when the frontal offensive of Soviet troops would force the German command to maneuver reserves and transfer reinforcements. Under these conditions, the actions of Belov's cavalry mechanized group could have a disproportionately large effect, far exceeding the actual strength and firepower of the corps. General Zhukov, assessing the significance of the upcoming raid, said, "Every one of your squadrons behind enemy lines will be worth a division at the front." These words accurately reflected the strategic intent of the operation. The Soviet command expected that the Germans would be forced to withdraw significant forces from the front to combat Belov's corps, which would ease the task of the main advancing groups. Particular importance was attached to the Vyazma area, a key transportation hub through which a significant part of Army Group Center was supplied. Disrupting the operation of this hub could seriously complicate the situation of German troops, especially in the context of the unfolding Soviet counteroffensive. The plan provided not only for sabotage operations against enemy communications, but also for the capture and holding of certain areas in the German rear. This was intended to create the prerequisites for the encirclement of large groupings of enemy troops in subsequent operations. However, there was a significant gap between the strategic design and the real capabilities of the corps. The 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, despite being reinforced with tanks and artillery, remained a relatively light formation. Its strength did not exceed 12,000 men, and the number of tanks and artillery was limited. Operating in isolation from the main forces, without the possibility of regular supply and replenishment, the corps could only rely on its own strength and partisan support. Belov understood these limitations and tried to convey them to the higher command. He insisted on more realistic objectives and better logistical support for the operation. Nevertheless, strategic necessity demanded action, even if it involved high risk. Ultimately, the Stavka compromised. Belov's corps was promised air support for supply and evacuation of the wounded, as well as coordination of actions with partisan detachments. The objectives were also adjusted. They now corresponded more closely to the real capabilities of the cavalry mechanized group. Behind enemy lines, Belov's corps found itself in a completely different reality of war. There was no continuous line of defense, no artillery support, and no reliable rear. Instead, there was constant maneuvering, sudden clashes, and the need to rely solely on their own strength. Belov's tactics in these conditions became a model of military art for operations in encirclement. First and foremost, the corps commander refused to concentrate his forces. He divided the formation into several mobile groups, each acting relatively independently, but within the framework of a common plan. This prevented the Germans from delivering a decisive blow to the entire corps, and created the impression among the enemy that significantly larger forces were operating behind their lines. The basis of the tactics was rapid raids. Cavalry squadrons suddenly appeared at German communications, struck, and quickly withdrew, not allowing the enemy to organize a pursuit. Tanks were used as a mobile reserve. They advanced to areas of successful cavalry actions and consolidated the achieved success. Belov attached particular importance to reconnaissance. Special reconnaissance units operated within each group, gathering information about the enemy, studying the terrain, and identifying the most vulnerable targets. Mounted messengers were used for communication with these groups, and in some cases, radio stations, although their operation was always fraught with the risk of detection. Supplying the corps in the enemy's rear presented a particular challenge. Belov solved it comprehensively. Some ammunition and provisions were delivered by air, some were captured from the enemy, and some were provided by partisans and the local population. The cavalrymen learned to conserve resources economically, especially ammunition, using it only for the most important objectives. Interaction with partisans became a key element of success. Partisan detachments not only provided intelligence and guides, but also participated in joint operations. Belov personally met with commanders of large partisan formations, coordinating actions. The local population also provided invaluable assistance. Peasants sheltered the wounded, provided food, and warned about enemy movements. Belov strictly forbade his soldiers from any requisitions. Everything necessary was acquired only with the consent of the residents, often in exchange for captured weapons or medicines. Medical support required special attention. Field hospitals were deployed in the corps, but the evacuation of the seriously wounded was difficult. Sometimes they were entrusted to the care of local residents, sometimes evacuated by planes from improvised airfields. Belov understood that morale was crucial in encirclement. He constantly appeared in various units, personally led the most complex operations, and shared all the hardships of the raid with his soldiers. A particularly valuable quality of the commander was the ability to make quick decisions in a changing environment. When the Germans began to gather significant forces to fight the corps, Belov immediately changed tactics, moving from active operations to a temporary lull, only to strike in an unexpected place later. Belov's cavalry mechanized group demonstrated its full potential during the raid behind enemy lines. One vivid combat episode occurred in mid-December 1941, when the Corps' advanced squadrons attacked a German convoy near the village of Dugino. The cavalrymen, using the deep snow as cover, stealthily approached the road and suddenly attacked from two sides. Tanks, pre-positioned, blocked the escape routes. The result was the complete annihilation of the convoy. More than 30 trucks with ammunition and fuel became the Corps' prize. The interaction of cavalry with tanks proved particularly effective in wooded and swampy terrain. Cavalry patrols discovered weak points in the enemy's defenses, blazed routes through seemingly impassable areas, and then tanks delivered an unexpected blow. The German command, accustomed to the operations of mechanized units on roads, was unprepared for the appearance of Soviet tanks, where their presence seemed impossible. In January 1942, Belov's corps conducted a brilliant operation to capture an airfield near Vyazma. Intelligence reported that the Germans were using this airfield to supply their units. Belov devised a daring plan. While the main forces of the corps feigned an attack from the north, distracting the enemy, a combined detachment of cavalrymen and tankmen made a 40-kilometer march through the forests and suddenly attacked the airfield from the south. The German guard was caught off guard. As a result of the operation, 12 aircraft on the ground were destroyed, fuel and ammunition depots were captured, and the airfield itself was put out of action. Winter conditions, which proved a trial for German troops, were used by Belov's corps as an advantage. Cavalrymen moved on skis. Tanks were equipped with wide tracks that prevented them from getting stuck in the snow. Belov demanded from commanders of all levels special attention to preserving personnel and equipment in harsh winter conditions. Portable heating points were set up in each squadron, and the supply of warm clothing and hot food was organized. The enemy tried to counter the Corps' raiding operations. The German command allocated special mobile groups to combat Belov's cavalrymen, strengthened the security of communications, and began conducting punitive operations against local residents who supported Soviet troops. However, Belov skillfully adapted tactics to the changing situation. One of the key elements of success was the use of wandering detachments tactics. The Corps did not operate as a single mass, but divided into several autonomous groups, each of which included cavalry, tanks, and artillery. These groups constantly changed their areas of operation, preventing the enemy from concentrating forces for a decisive blow. When the Germans began an operation against one group, others became active in different places, creating the impression for the enemy of the presence of large Soviet forces over a vast territory. The tactic of night raids proved particularly successful. Using their good knowledge of the terrain and the help of local guides, Belov's cavalrymen made swift night marches and struck German garrisons at dawn, when enemy vigilance decreased. After such raids, the groups quickly retreated, preventing the enemy from organizing a pursuit. In February 1942, the Corps carried out a series of successful operations against enemy railway communications. Cavalry detachments, reinforced by sappers, blew up bridges, destroyed tracks, and caused train wrecks. As a result, the supply of German troops was seriously disrupted, which complicated their position in the context of the general Soviet offensive. Belov constantly improved the tactics of interaction between different branches of service. Special attention was paid to coordinating the actions of cavalry and tanks. Special signals were developed that allowed effective combat control in conditions where radio communication was limited due to the danger of direction finding. By the end of March 1942, the situation of Belov's corps became critical. 4 months of raiding operations behind enemy lines had exhausted their strength and resources. Ammunition was running low, the number of wounded was growing, and the German command, realizing the danger posed by the cavalry mechanized group, was concentrating more and more forces to eliminate it. The headquarters of the Supreme High Command decided to withdraw the corps from encirclement. However, this was a task no less difficult than the raid itself. The Germans had blocked all obvious routes, and the front line had stabilized by this time, making a breakthrough particularly difficult. Belov developed a daring plan. The corps was divided into several groups, each of which was to break through independently, along different routes. This dispersed enemy forces and increased the chances of success. The main group, under Belov's personal command, included the most combat-ready units, heavy weapons, and most of the wounded. To distract the enemy, demonstration actions were organized in several directions. Partisan detachments, interacting with the corps, intensified their activity, simulating preparations for a breakthrough in other sectors. On May 23, 1942, the breakthrough began. At night, in pouring rain, Belov's cavalrymen attacked German positions in the area of the village of Buslava. Surprise and decisiveness ensured initial success. Forward squadrons broke through the first line of defense, and the tanks following them widened the breach. However, the Germans quickly recovered and threw reserves into a counterattack. A fierce battle ensued. Belov, in the thick of the action, personally directed the actions of the units. When one of the tank platoons was stopped by anti-tank artillery fire, the general led a cavalry attack in an outflanking maneuver, which allowed neutralizing the German guns. By dawn, the main forces of the corps had broken through the German positions, but new challenges awaited them ahead. The enemy brought up aircraft, which continuously attacked the corps columns. Belov decided to move only at night and take cover in the forests during the day. This slowed down the advance but reduced losses. Crossing the Ugra River, controlled by the enemy, presented particular difficulty. Reconnaissance discovered a weakly guarded section where it was decided to force the river. On the night of May 26, the advanced units of the corps began to cross. Sappers built temporary rafts for heavy weapons and the wounded, and cavalry swam across. When the Germans discovered the crossing and opened artillery fire, it was already too late. The main forces of the corps were on the opposite bank. On June 10, 1942, the leading units of Belov's corps reached the location of Soviet troops. The operation to break out of encirclement was completed. Of the 12,000 men who went on the raid, about 8,000 returned, an incredibly high figure for such operations. The Soviet command highly appreciated the results of Belov's corps' raid. In his report to the headquarters, General Zhukov noted, "The actions of the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps tied up significant enemy forces, disrupted its communications, and had a significant impact on the overall course of the Battle of Moscow." Belov himself was awarded the Order of Lenin and received the rank of Lieutenant General. Belov's corps' raid became one of the most successful operations of its kind in the history of the Great Patriotic War. It proved the effectiveness of cavalry mechanized formations in conditions where fully motorized units experienced difficulties. For Belov himself, this experience was invaluable. He learned important lessons about the interaction of different branches of service, about the importance of maneuver and surprise, and about the psychological aspects of combat operations in encirclement. He later applied these lessons while commanding larger formations. The raid behind enemy lines near Moscow became not only an important page in Pavel Belov's military biography, but also a significant episode in the history of the evolution of military art, showing how a traditional branch of service can adapt to the conditions of modern warfare and find its place in it. After the legendary raid deep behind enemy lines near Moscow, Pavel Belov's career took off. In June 1942, he was appointed commander of the 61st Army and soon received the rank of Colonel General. This appointment marked a significant turning point in his military career, from commanding a cavalry corps to leading a large combined arms formation. For Belov, this transition was not a mere formality. It demanded a substantial broadening of his military thinking, an assimilation of new principles for managing diverse forces. A combined arms army is a complex mechanism, including rifle and artillery divisions, tank brigades, engineer units, and aviation. Commanding such a formation is significantly more challenging than even a reinforced cavalry corps. However, the experience of raid operations proved invaluable for Belov in his new post. He brought to Army command the principles of maneuverability and flexibility, characteristic of cavalry formations. One of the staff officers of the 61st Army recalled, "General Belov thought not in terms of lines on a map, but volumetrically. He saw the battlefield as a three-dimensional space where not only the front and flanks were important, but also depth and the possibility of penetrating the enemy's rear." In the battles near Stalingrad, the 61st Army under Belov's command proved itself to be one of the most effective formations. Belov's qualities as a commander were especially evident during Operation Uranus, the strategic encirclement of the German group. Belov's army operated on one of the key axes, breaking through the enemy's defenses and linking up with the troops of the Southwestern Front, closing the encirclement ring. It is interesting that even while commanding a large combined arms formation, Belov did not forget the lessons of cavalry tactics. He actively used mobile detachments that penetrated gaps in the enemy's defense and exploited success, preventing the Germans from organizing a new defense line. In essence, this was the application of cavalry raid principles, but on a new level and with the use of modern equipment. In 1943, Belov participated in the planning and execution of Operation Bagration, one of the largest offensive operations of the Great Patriotic War. Here, his understanding of the interaction of various branches of service was fully manifested. Under his leadership, mobile groups were created, including tanks, motorized infantry, and artillery, which, after breaking through the enemy's defenses, rapidly advanced, preventing the Germans from consolidating on intermediate lines. By the end of the war, Belov's military thinking had undergone significant evolution. From a commander specializing in cavalry operations, he transformed into a broad-profile military leader capable of managing large combined arms formations in complex modern operations. At the same time, he did not renounce his cavalry past, but creatively reinterpreted it, elevating the principles of maneuverability and flexibility to a new level of military art. In the post-war years, Pavel Alexeyevich actively participated in summarizing the combat experience of the war. His analytical works on strategy and tactics received high praise in military circles. His studies on actions in the enemy's rear, the organization of raid operations, and the interaction of various branches of service were considered particularly valuable. Belov's fate is the story of a military leader's successful adaptation to the rapidly changing conditions of modern warfare. He managed to overcome the limitations of his initial specialization and grow to the level of a commander capable of thinking in the grand categories of strategic operations. At the same time, he retained the best qualities of a cavalry commander. decisiveness, the ability to improvise, and an understanding of the importance of maneuver and surprise. Pavel Belov's military art represents a unique fusion of classical cavalry thinking with modern principles of motorized warfare. Analyzing his command style, we observe a rare combination of qualities that enabled him to become one of the most effective military leaders of his era. First and foremost, Belov was distinguished by an exceptional capacity for improvisation. In constantly changing circumstances, especially during the raid behind enemy lines near Moscow, he instantly adapted plans to new realities. When the Germans blocked one route, Belov immediately found an alternative. When ammunition ran out, he organized raids on enemy depots. When radio communication failed, he established a system of mounted couriers. This flexibility of thought allowed him to transform problems into opportunities. Belov's second distinguishing characteristic was his decisiveness. He was not afraid to take responsibility for risky decisions if he saw potential for success in them. During the breakout from encirclement in May 1942, when many officers considered the task impossible, it was Belov's firm belief in success that became the decisive factor. He personally led the attack on the most difficult sector, setting an example for his subordinates. This decisiveness, however, never descended into recklessness. Belov carefully weighed risks, analyzed alternatives, and only then made a decision, which he then executed with unwavering persistence. Belov's understanding of the interaction between different branches of service deserves special attention. Long before it became common practice, he created an effective system of coordination between cavalry, tanks, artillery, and engineer units within his corps. Each branch of service was utilized where it could demonstrate its best qualities. Cavalry provided reconnaissance and maneuver, tanks, striking power, artillery, fire support, sappers, overcoming obstacles. Moreover, Belov did not merely mechanically combine different parts, but created an organic combat organism where all elements reinforced each other. The psychology of troop management in difficult conditions was another of Belov's strengths. He perfectly understood that in encirclement, with constant threat and limited resources, morale becomes a decisive factor. Belov paid great attention to maintaining the fighting spirit of his subordinates. He often appeared at the front lines, shared all difficulties with the soldiers, and knew many soldiers by name. At the same time, he never concealed the real state of affairs from his subordinates, but always showed the way to overcome difficulties. One of the corps officers recalled, "After a conversation with the general, even the most difficult tasks seemed achievable." An important element of Belov's command style was his ability to view the battlefield volumetrically, in 3 dimensions. He did not think in linear fronts and flanks, like many commanders of his time. For him, the theater of operations was a space of opportunities, where not only directions but also time, speed, and surprise were important. This volumetric thinking allowed him to find unexpected solutions where others saw only a dead end. Belov possessed a rare talent for anticipating enemy actions. He could put himself in the enemy commander's shoes, calculate their logic, and predict their reaction. This allowed him to prepare countermeasures in advance, seize the initiative, and impose his will on the enemy. During the raid, his corps repeatedly avoided encirclement precisely thanks to Belov's ability to foresee the actions of the German command. Another distinguishing feature of Belov was his ability to effectively utilize the local population. He understood that in partisan warfare, the support of the inhabitants is crucial. Belov forbade any requisitions, established respectful relations with the peasants, and involved them as guides and scouts. As a result, the corps received invaluable information about the enemy and assistance that could not be obtained otherwise. Analyzing Belov's military art, one cannot fail to note his ability to learn and adapt. He constantly analyzed combat experience, drew lessons from successes and failures, and improved tactics. Each operation became a source of new ideas and approaches. This ability for continuous professional growth allowed him to successfully transition from commanding a cavalry corps to leading a combined arms army. Belov's command style formed an entire school of military thought. Many officers who passed through his school later became outstanding military leaders. They adopted his approaches to organizing the interaction of different branches of service, the principles of maneuver warfare, and the psychology of management in difficult conditions. Thus, Pavel Belov's military art represents not just an individual command style, but a holistic system of views on modern warfare, a system in which traditional cavalry principles of maneuver, surprise, and decisiveness are organically combined with an understanding of the role of technology, firepower, and the interaction of different branches of service. This system proved its effectiveness in the most challenging conditions of the Great Patriotic War and remains relevant for study by modern military specialists. By 1943, the role of cavalry in the Great Patriotic War had undergone significant changes. If at the beginning of the conflict, cavalry units were forced to confront Wehrmacht tank wedges, often sustaining heavy losses, they had now found their niche within the structure of the Soviet armed forces. Pavel Belov, whose experience in commanding cavalry mechanized units was unique, made a significant contribution to this transformation. By this period, cavalry corps had transformed into highly mobile formations with powerful firepower potential. Their composition now included not only traditional cavalry regiments, but also self-propelled artillery units, tank battalions, and motorized infantry. In essence, these were no longer purely cavalry, but combined formations, blending the advantages of various branches of service. Belov, drawing on his experience from the raid near Moscow, actively participated in developing new forms of employing these units. He insisted on using cavalry corps not for frontal assaults, but for deep flanking maneuvers, enveloping enemy flanks, and operating on communications. In one of his analytical notes for the General Staff, he wrote, "The cavalry corps should not be a hammer, but a sharp knife, dissecting the enemy's defenses in its most vulnerable spots." These ideas found practical application in the operations of 1943 to 1945. During the Belarusian operation, cavalry units acted as the vanguard of advancing troops, bypassing enemy strongholds and creating conditions for their encirclement. In the Vistula-Oder operation, cavalry mechanized groups conducted swift raids deep into German defenses, seizing crossings and vital communication hubs. The interaction between cavalry corps and tank armies proved particularly effective. Tank units delivered powerful frontal blows, breaking through enemy defenses, while cavalry, utilizing the created gaps, surged deep into enemy positions. This combination of the tank's striking power with the cavalry's maneuverability yielded impressive results. Belov actively promoted the idea of special training for cavalry officers to operate in conjunction with tanks and aviation. At his initiative, courses were organized where squadron and regimental commanders studied the fundamentals of tank tactics, learned to direct aviation to targets, and mastered modern communication tools. This allowed for overcoming the traditional disunity of various branches of service and creating truly integrated combat units. An important aspect of the cavalry's transformation was the change in its technical equipment. By the end of the war, cavalry units were armed with the latest models of anti-tank weapons, automatic small arms, and modern communication equipment. Mounted squadrons could now effectively combat enemy armored vehicles, significantly enhancing their combat capabilities. Pavel Belov paid particular attention to the logistical support of cavalry units. He understood that in modern warfare, it was not enough to have only well-trained soldiers and commanders. A corresponding technical base was necessary. At his insistence, Cavalry Corps received an increased number of motor vehicles for transporting ammunition, provisions, and fodder, which significantly increased their autonomy. In the final stage of the war, cavalry units actively participated in the Berlin Operation and the liberation of Eastern European countries. Their ability to operate in rugged terrain and in conditions of destroyed infrastructure proved highly valuable. Cavalry mechanized groups conducted deep raids, cutting off enemy retreat routes and contributing to their encirclement and destruction. By the end of the war, it became evident that the era of classical cavalry was drawing to a close. The future belonged to fully motorized units. However, the transformation that Soviet cavalry underwent during the war years under the leadership of commanders like Pavel Belov allowed it to make a significant contribution to victory and honorably complete its historical mission. Pavel Belov's legacy in military science extends far beyond his personal biography. The experience of the cavalry general, who managed to adapt to the realities of motorized warfare, became the subject of meticulous study in the post-war years. Military theorists from various countries analyzed the unique phenomenon of cavalry mechanized formations under Belov's command, drawing lessons relevant even in the era of full motorization of armies. One of the key aspects of Belov's legacy was his understanding of the role of mobile forces in modern warfare. Long before the concept of air-mobile operations became widely accepted, he demonstrated how small but highly maneuverable formations could exert a disproportionately large influence on the course of hostilities. His Corps' raid near Moscow became a classic example of how a relatively small grouping could tie down significant enemy forces, disrupt their communications, and create chaos in the rear areas. In the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, when doctrines for the use of helicopters in military operations were being formed, many theorists turned to Belov's experience. His principles of action in the enemy's rear, the organization of autonomous supply, interaction with the local population and partisans, proved surprisingly applicable to the new conditions. American military experts, analyzing the experience of the Vietnam War, repeatedly referred to Belov's raiding operations as a historical precedent. Another important aspect of Belov's legacy was his concept of the interaction of different branches of service. At a time when army structures often suffered from interdepartmental competition and disunity, he created a model of effective integration of cavalry, tanks, artillery, and engineer units. Each element reinforced the others, compensating for their weaknesses. This model subsequently formed the basis of the concept of combined arms combat, which became standard in the post-war period. Of particular value is Belov's experience in adapting a traditional branch of service to new technological realities. Instead of clinging to outdated forms or completely abandoning accumulated experience, he found a way to transform cavalry, preserving its best qualities and complementing them with new capabilities. This lesson proved especially relevant in an era of rapid technological change, when military organizations constantly face the need to integrate new weapon systems and tactical concepts. In the 70s, when military academies in various countries studied the experience of World War II, Belov's legacy was considered in the context of the theory of asymmetric conflicts. His ability to successfully counter a technologically superior enemy, using unconventional tactics and local conditions, was of particular interest. Soviet, American, and European military theorists found valuable lessons in his experience for developing strategies to counter a potential enemy with superior firepower. In the 80s, with the development of the airland operation concept, Belov's experience received a new interpretation. His approach to organizing deep raids, coordinating the actions of various branches of service, and managing under conditions of limited communication, proved surprisingly consonant with new doctrinal developments. Military analysts noted that many principles that Belov applied intuitively, based on his experience and military intuition, received theoretical justification only decades later. In modern military academies, The raid of Belov's corps behind enemy lines near Moscow is studied as a classic example of a successful deep strike operation. Cadets analyze his decisions, tactical methods, ways of organizing supply, and maintaining morale in extreme conditions. Special attention is paid to the psychological aspects of command. Belov's ability to inspire subordinates and take decisive action in critical situations. Pavel Alexeyevich Belov stands in the history of military art as a unique figure. The last cavalry general who not only survived, but also thrived in the era of motorized warfare. His life path symbolically connected two military epochs: the fading world of cavalry charges and the dawning era of mechanized armies. Belov's phenomenon lies in his astonishing ability to adapt. He did not cling to the past for nostalgic reasons, nor did he reject the valuable experience of traditional cavalry. Instead, he created a synthesis. Combined cavalry mechanized formations that blended the maneuverability of cavalry with the firepower of modern technology. The legendary raid of his corps behind enemy lines near Moscow in the winter of 1941 was not merely a successful military operation. It demonstrated a new philosophy of warfare. In conditions where German motorized units lost mobility due to the harsh winter and impassable roads, Belov's cavalry mechanized group maintained its ability to maneuver, striking where they were least expected. Belov's military legacy extends far beyond cavalry tactics. His principles of operating in the enemy's rear, organizing autonomous operations, and coordinating various branches of service proved remarkably consonant with modern concepts of special operations and air-mobile actions. In contemporary military science, Belov's experience is more relevant than ever. In an era of asymmetric conflicts, hybrid wars, and confrontation with a technologically superior adversary, his lessons take on new meaning. The ability to adapt to changing conditions, utilize local specifics, and combine traditional methods with the latest technologies. All these principles of Belov are in demand by today's military strategists. It is symbolic that a man who began his service in an era when cavalry was considered the queen of battlefields ended it as commander of a modern combined arms army. This path reflects not only the personal evolution of a military leader, but also the transformation of military art itself in the 20th century. Pavel Belov remains in history as a military leader who proved that true mastery does not depend on technology. Weapons and means of transportation change, but the fundamental principles of military art remain constant: surprise, maneuver, concentration of effort, morale. Belov perfectly mastered these principles and knew how to apply them in all conditions. A horseman between epochs. This metaphor accurately characterizes Belov's place in military history. He did not merely survive the shift in technological paradigms. He actively participated in shaping the new face of war, while preserving the best traditions of the past. His legacy reminds us that at the heart of military art always lies the human factor: intellect, will, leadership, the ability to inspire people to feats, even in the most difficult conditions.